Welcome back to the 6Ps podcast, and today we're going to shift our focus to the Crucible, and we're going to do a guided reading and annotate the first 10 pages from Arthur Miller's play The Crucible. So when it comes to the areas of comparison for this first section of The Crucible, we're really looking at the ideas surrounding insular, conservative, vengeful, toxic communities. And this section provides us with a clear overview of what life is like in Salem. We also can touch upon here things like social hierarchy, who has power, who doesn't, and the class system in the town. A little bit on gender roles and fear, particularly in terms of what fear or what drives fear within characters like Paris, for example. It's other people. In Abigail and Tituba, it's punishment. To give you a brief overview of this section, we are introduced, as I said before, to the Puritan town of Salem, their beliefs and their lifestyle. And actually, Miller provides us with a really detailed overview of this. And it's really important that you study those first 4 pages in great depth, because there's a lot of content that you can utilize that describes the town and that you can link quite nicely and quite fluently to life in Dangatar in the Dressmaker. Now, Salem's leader is Reverend Samuel Parris, who is, of course, religious. His daughter Betty will not wake up, and he is very worried because there is a rumour in the town that Betty is witched. Now, he believes it has something to do with his niece Abigail, as he caught her and the other girls dancing like heathen in the forest, and Abigail is one of the main antagonists in the text. Now, the text begins with this note regarding the historical accuracy of the play. And it reads, "This play is not history in the sense in which the word is used by the academic historian. Dramatic purposes have sometimes required many characters to be fused into one. The number of girls involved in the crying out has been reduced, and Abigail's age has been raised. While there were several judges of almost equal authority, I have symbolised them all in Hathorne and Danforth. However, I believe that the reader will discover here the essential nature of one of the strangest and most awful chapters in human history, and the fate of each character is exactly that of his historical model. And there is no one in the drama who did not play a similar and in some cases exactly the same role in history. As for the characters of the persons, little is known about most of them, excepting what may be surmised from a few letters, the trial record, certain broadsides written at the time, and references to their conduct in sources of varying reliability. They may therefore be taken as creations of my own, drawn to the best of my ability in conformity with their known behaviour, except as indicated in the commentary I've written for this text." So Miller directly addresses the audience and suggests that this play is historically accurate. It provides a sense of reliability on the matter as well, and he has taken some dramatic license with the characters' personalities and traits, and we see the main one, of course, is Abigail's age, which is raised, and you might sort of consider why that might be the case. Of course, we've got the romantic link to John Proctor, which we don't assume is happened in real life. She is 17 in the play and she was 11 in real life. You might want to consider why that might be, and perhaps why as well he's reduced the amount of judges. Potentially, I think this is the case because we get more of an idea about who, especially Judge Danforth, who is quite prominent in Act 3 and Act 4. We get more of an idea into his stubborn perspective and his view on the law. So Act 1 begins with some stage directions, followed by some commentary. So the stage directions pretty much just explain the setting. I won't go read through this, but just so you know, it sort of depicts the austere nature of Puritan life in Salem. And again, that very bland and boring atmosphere throughout the town. I'm going to start with this commentary or authorial intrusion, as we also call it, where Miller directly addresses the audience and provides some information about the characters, the settings, and also at times his own motivations behind reading the text. So there are 3 types of text. You've got the italics, which are stage directions. Often they are found in brackets as well. You've got the plain text, which is the commentary, and then you've got the dialogue as well, where you'll see the character's name in capital letters first. So I'll begin the commentary, and it says, "At the time of these events, Paris was in his middle 40s. In history, he cut a villainous path, and there is very little good to be said for him. A really great description to describe Paris, and immediately as an audience, we're already against him. Very little can be said for him. He believed he was being persecuted wherever he went, and despite his best efforts to win people and God to his side. In meeting, he felt insulted if someone rose to shut the door without first asking for permission. He needed to have control of the town. In fact, he ensured that he had complete control of the town. He was a widower with no interest in children or talent with them. He regarded them as young adults, and until this strange crisis, he, like the rest of Salem, never conceived that the children were anything but thankful for being permitted to walk straight, eyes slightly lowered, arms at the sides, and mouths shut until bidden to speak. I could tell you that quotation off by heart. It's a great one because, well, firstly, the foreshadowing and the irony is that the children end up having all the power in the town, but also the fact that this is one of the reasons why the children act out, is because they're so suppressed. His house stood in the town, but we today would hardly call it a village. The meeting house was nearby, and from this point outward, towards the bay or inland, there were a few small windowed dark houses snuggling against the raw Massachusetts winter. Salem had been established hardly 40 years before, and to the European world, the whole province was a barbaric frontier inhabited by a sect of fanatics who, nevertheless, were shipping out products of slowly increasing quantity and value. I love that quote about it being a barbaric frontier. Of course, it is on the edge of a settlement and civilization to an extent. I also like this outside perspective of Salem, which links in nicely to the Dressmaker. We get in the first chapter, a description of the town, and we also get an outsider who visits the town too later on in the text, and how they view the town is very different to how the town views itself. No one can really know what their lives were like. They had no novelists and would not have permitted anyone to read a novel if one were handy. A great quote here: their creed forbade anything resembling a theatre or vain enjoyment. They did not celebrate Christmas, and a holiday from work meant only that they must concentrate even more upon prayer. This creed was what we would call like a belief system, which is prominent in many Christian religions, and the idea that definitely there was no room for anything of vain enjoyment. So we hear references to laughter being condemned throughout the text, and this is definitely true. The idea is that through hard work, discipline, and prayer, that is how one must live their life in a Puritan town. And it's described here, which is not to say that nothing broke into this strict and somber way of life. That strict and somber way of life is a really good quotation to describe and depict the atmosphere in Salem. So when a new farmhouse was built, friends assembled to raise the roof, and there would be special foods cooked and probably some potent cider passed around. There was a good supply of ne'er-do-wells in Salem who dallied at the shovelboard in Bridget Bishop's tavern. Possibly more than the creed, hard work kept the morals of the place from spoiling, for the people were forced to fight the land like heroes for every grain of corn, and no man had very much time for fooling around. This was land that was really hard to cultivate and really difficult. Just like we have in Dungatar, we've got these agrarian societies that are built on agriculture. So interesting to note that there's grains in both as well, but it was a really hard place to make a living, and therefore Miller suggests here that that's what stopped immorality really to begin with. Miller says there were some jokers, however, is indicated by the practice of appointing a two-man patrol whose duty was to walk forth in the time of God's worship to take notice of such as either lie about the meeting house without attending to the word and ordinances, or that lie at home or in the fields without giving good account thereof, and to take the names of such persons and to present them to the magistrate, whereby they may be accordingly proceeded against. So 2 people were appointed to look out at what the villagers were doing, to take note if they didn't attend church, which was seen to be one of the non-negotiables, but also to ensure they weren't working on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath, that day of the week, which is devoted entirely to prayer and to God. And the next quote is really nice because it links in beautifully with the Dressmaker. This predilection for minding other people's business was time honoured among the people of Salem, and it undoubtedly created many of the suspicions which were to feed the coming madness. Just like we have in the Dressmaker, this idea that especially the women continually talk about each other. Everyone knows everyone's business. Beulah Harradine is a prime example of that. And it's similar in Salem. In these small communities, everyone knows each other's business. And it says here that it fuels the coming madness. So too do some of the events in The Dressmaker, that characters are motivated by these rumours and by the gossiping that occurs. It was also, in my opinion, again, Miller uses first person here. This is his belief. He's talking directly to the audience. That one of the things that a John Proctor would rebel against, for the time of the armed camp had almost passed, and since the country was reasonably, although not wholly safe, the old disciplines were beginning to rankle. But, as in all such matters, the issue was not clear-cut, for danger was still a possibility, and in unity still lay the best promise of safety. What Miller's trying to say here is essentially life was so tough that, to an extent, they all agreed to work together because that's how they were safe. If they started acting selfishly, then the town would be in severe danger. We're going to find out why in a moment, but the idea that in unity still lay the best promise of safety, that was really important. That kept a sense of community together in Salem. And this is why, because the edge of the wilderness was close by. The American continent stretched endlessly west, and it was full of mystery for them. It stood dark and threatening over their shoulders night and day, for out of it Indian tribes marauded from time to time, and Reverend Parris had parishioners who had lost relatives to these heathen. The parochial snobbery, I love that word parochial, great word to describe the town of Salem, of these people was partly responsible for the failure to convert the Indians, and probably they also preferred to take land from heathens rather than from fellow Christians. At any rate, very few Indians were converted, and the Salem folk believed that the virgin forest was the devil's last preserve, his home base and the citadel of his final stand. To the best of their knowledge, the American forest was the last place on earth that was not paying homage to the god. And we know particularly that the Native Americans were a real threat. And we'll find out later on that Abigail Williams's parents were killed by Indians. So, again, by being united, this sort of protected them against attacks. For these reasons, among others, they carried about an air of innate resistance, even of persecution. Their fathers had, of course, been persecuted in England. So they're talking about the Puritans here. Yes, they were driven out of England. They went to America to seek religious freedom. So now they and their church found it necessary to deny any other sect its freedom, lest their New Jerusalem be defiled and corrupted by the wrong ways and deceitful ideas. They were very protective about their town. They believed, in short, that they held in their steady hands the candle that would light the world. We've inherited this belief, and it has helped and hurt us. It helped them with the discipline it gave them. They were dedicated folk by and large, and they had to be in order to survive the life they had chosen or been born into this country. The proof of their beliefs' value to them may be taken from the opposite character of the first Jamestown settlement farther south in Virginia. And Jamestown, of course, was one of the first settlements by the English in what we now know as America. The Englishmen who landed there were motivated mainly by a hunt for profit. They had thought to pick off the wealth of the new country and then return rich to England. And they were a band of individualists and a much more ingratiating group than the Massachusetts men. But Virginia destroyed them. And Massachusetts tried to kill off the Puritans, but they set up a communal society which in the beginning was little more than an armed camp, with an autocratic and very devoted leadership. It was, however, an autocracy by consent. For they were united from top to bottom by commonly held ideology whose perpetuation was a reason and justification for all their suffering. So, their self-denial, their purposefulness, their suspicion of all vain pursuits, their hard-handed justice were altogether perfect instruments for the conquest of this space so antagonistic to man. Essentially what this means is that other settlements didn't work because they were fueled by individualists, people who were in it for themselves, who were self-centered, who were greedy. The reason why Salem worked is because they were more selfless. And all these things added together to ensure that they actually survived. This land is called antagonistic to men. It's so antagonistic to men. This was a really hard and harsh place to live, but they managed to survive. And it says a lot about them as individuals who are quite resilient. But as we're going to find out later on, cracks do start to appear within this society. But the people of Salem in 1692 were not quite the dedicated folk that arrived on the Mayflower. The Mayflower was, of course, the ship that the first Puritans landed in. A vast differentiation had taken place, and in their own time a revolution had unseated the royal government and substituted a junta which was at this moment in power. The times to their eyes must have been out of joint, and to the common folk must have seemed as insoluble and complicated as do ours today. It is not hard to see how easily many could have been led to believe that the time of confusion had been brought upon them by deep and darkening forces. No hint of such speculation appears on the court record, but social disorder in any age breeds such mystical suspicions. Something that is still very much prevalent today. We've noticed it even with the recent virus. And when as in Salem wonders are brought forth from below the social surface, it is too much to expect people to hold back very long from laying on the victims with all the force of their frustration. Note how Miller makes reference to 1950s America here. He says that as do ours today, he mentions 1950s America. But what he's trying to sort of say here is that people use these crises or this social breakdown in order to blame others, in order to vent their frustrations. And he goes on to say the Salem tragedy, which is about to begin in these pages, developed from a paradox, and it is a paradox in whose group we still live, and there is no prospect yet that we will discover its resolution. Simply it was this: for good purposes, even high purposes, the people of Salem developed a theocracy, a combine of state and religious power, whose function was to keep the community together and to prevent any kind of disunity that might open it to destruction by material or ideological enemies. It was forged for a necessary purpose and accomplished that purpose, that idea of them surviving. But all organisation is and must be grounded on the idea of exclusion and prohibition, just as two objects cannot occupy the same space. Evidently, the time came in New England when the repressions of order were heavier than seemed warranted by the dangers against which the order was organised. The witch hunt was a perverse manifestation of the panic which set in among all classes when the balance began to turn towards greater individual freedom. And that is something that is really apt when we talk about what's going on today. It's this idea about acting for your own personal benefit or acting for the benefit of the community. In Salem, they were purely motivated by that sense of community. Once there was a crack though, once one person went against that, it was open slather, and people would act and speak for themselves. And this is what caused the witch trials. This is what caused all this blame, and for people to be victimised, particularly those who are vulnerable within this society. We're talking about mainly women, of course. When one rises above the individual villainy displayed, one can only pity them all, just as we shall be pitied some day. It is still impossible for man to organise his social life without repressions, and the balance has yet to be struck between order and freedom. The witch hunt was not, however, a mere repression. It was also, and as importantly, a long overdue opportunity for everyone so inclined to express publicly his guilt and sins under the cover of accusations against victims. And we have this irony here of this Christian community where people were confessing their sins but blaming other people for it with no logical, concrete evidence. And irony is riddled throughout this play. And it says it suddenly became possible and patriotic and holy. So not just possible, it also became seen as something quite holy, quite devout, for a man to say that Martha Corey had come into his bedroom at night and that while his wife was sleeping at his side, Martha laid herself down on his chest and nearly suffocated him. Notice he's quoting that. This is coming from his court records. Miller's done his research here. Of course it was her spirit only, but his satisfaction at confessing himself was no lighter than it had been for Martha herself. One could ordinarily speak such things in public. And a lot of the evidence was this idea about individual spirits coming and forcing them to, or doing certain things to them, or forcing them to act in a certain way, which of course we look at and say that lacks all rationality or logic, but it was considered as evidence in this town. Long-held hatreds of neighbours could now be openly expressed and vengeance taken despite the Bible's charitable injunctions. There's that idea of vengeance, which of course comes up in the Dressmaker, but people use the witch trials as a vehicle for vengeance. Landlust, this idea that individuals wanted more and more land because more land meant more power. So landlust, which had been expressed before by constant bickering over boundaries and deeds, could now be elevated to the arena of morality. One could cry witch against one's neighbour and feel perfectly justified in the bargain. Old scores could be settled on a plane of heavenly combat between Lucifer and the Lord, and suspicions and the envy of the miserable towards the happy could and did burst out in general revenge. And I should say before I go on, that this belief in the devil and this belief system which was based on good and evil, that black and white thinking, was real in this town. They definitely believed in the devil, and that was a real fear. In fact, many characters are motivated by fear of the devil. So that's Miller's commentary to start the text. There's then more stage directions, and it says that Reverend Paris is praying now, and though we cannot hear his words, a sense of his confusion hangs about him. He mumbles and seems about to weep, and then he weeps, and then he prays again, but his daughter does not stir in the bed. He's very worried. The door opens, and his slave enters. Tituba is in her 40s. Paris brought her with him from Barbados, where he spent some years as a merchant before entering the ministry. She enters as one does who can no longer bear to be barred from the sight of her beloved, but she is also very frightened because her slave sense has warned her that, as always, trouble in this house eventually lands on her back. Two things. Firstly, yes, Paris was a merchant before he joined the ministry. It works nicely for us because we know he's a really greedy individual. He's driven by money and by profit. And that gives us an inkling in these stage directions. And also Tituba, her position as a vulnerable and member of society, but also one who gets scapegoated because, she's frightened because trouble in this house eventually lands on her back. The idea that she is continually and always blamed. I'm just going to read through some of the dialogue now to start with. I'm not going to go through all the stage directions. I definitely encourage you to do so. I'm going to pick out the ones that I think are most important. Tituba says, "My Betty be hearty soon," and Paris says, "Out of here." Tituba says, "My Betty's not going to die. Out of here, out of my sight, out of my, oh my God, God help me." And he's quaking with fear and mumbling to himself through his sobs. He goes to the bed and gently takes Betty's hand. "Betty, child, dear child, will you wake? Will you open your eyes, Betty, little one?" Interesting to note that Paris particularly is driven by fear, and the word fear comes up throughout the stage directions in Act 1. We then get some more stage directions which introduces Abigail Williams, and it says he's bending to kneel again when his niece Abigail Williams, 17, enters. She's a strikingly beautiful girl, an orphan with an endless capacity for dissembling, and now she's all worried and apprehension and proprietary. Please note here that she has an endless capacity for dissembling. That means lying, and we know that the Salem witch trials are fueled by her continual lies. She says, "Uncle." Susanna Walcott's here from Dr. Griggs. "Oh, let her come in, let her come." Abigail says, "Come in, Susanna." And Susanna Walcott, a little younger than Abigail, a nervous, hurried girl, enters. You will notice that these characters are described before we meet them. This is in contrast to Rosalie Ham in the Crucible. We'll touch on this a little bit later, but note that as an audience, we gain a small understanding in some cases and a really strong understanding in others of who these characters are. So Paris, for example, there was significant text on page 13 to describe him. Abigail Williams was only a couple of sentences, but it varies from character to character. But again, Miller does it on purpose. Paris eagerly says, "What does the doctor say, child?" And Susanna says, "He bid me come and tell you, Reverend Sir, that he cannot discover no medicine for it in his books." "Then he must search on." "Aye, sir. He had been searching his books since he left you, sir, but he bid me tell you that you might look to unnatural things for the cause of it." Paris, his eyes going wide, which indicates that he's very worried, says, No, there be no unnatural cause here. Tell him I have sent for Reverend Hale of Beverley, and Mr. Hale will surely confirm that. Let him look to medicine and put out all thought of unnatural causes here. There be none. At this time, and again, we need to think about 1692, but if a doctor couldn't work out what was wrong with someone, then it was common sense, really, to look to the unnatural. That wasn't seen as something that was so shocking. It was seen as something that was quite logical, really. But Paris is really worried. We're going to find out a little bit later why he's worried. Susanna says, "Aye, sir, he bid me to tell you." Aye is the old-fashioned way of saying yes. It comes up again a lot throughout the text. Abigail says, "Speak nothing of it in the village, Susanna. Go directly home and speak nothing of unnatural causes. Aye, sir, I pray for her." Abigail says, Uncle, the rumour of witchcraft is all about. I think you'd best go down and deny it yourself. The parlour is packed of people, and I'll sit with her. And Paris says, and what shall I tell them? That my daughter and my niece I discovered dancing like heathen in the forest. So Paris's daughter can't wake up. The doctor suggests he needs to look for unnatural causes. He believes it has something to do with what he saw the other night, that Abigail and Betty were dancing like heathen in the forest. A nice simile there. Again, we know before that their creed forbade anything or any vain enjoyment, and dancing will definitely be considered that. So Paris is quite concerned, especially because it is individuals in his own house who are caught. He's a reverend, he's a religious leader of this town, and his own house is seen to be corrupt. That spells danger for him. Abigail says, Uncle, we did dance. Let you tell them I confessed it, and I'll be whipped if it must be, but they're speaking of witchcraft, and Betty is not witched. Abigail, I cannot go before the congregation when I know you have not opened with me. What did you do with her in the forest? We did dance, Uncle, and when you leapt out of the bush so suddenly, Betty was frightened, and then she fainted. And there's a whole of it. Child, sit you down. Abigail is referenced as a child continually by Paris and later on by Proctor. This idea of men underestimating women or underestimating Abigail continually occurs throughout this text. So Abigail is quavering and she says, I will never hurt Betty, I love her dearly. Now look you, child, your punishment will come in its time, but if you traffic with spirits in the forest, I must know it now. For surely my enemies will, and they will ruin me with it. But we never conjured spirits. Then why can she not move herself since midnight? This child is desperate. It must come out. My enemies will bring it out. Let me know what you have done there. Abigail, do you understand that I have many enemies? I have heard of it, Uncle. There is a faction that is sworn to drive me from my pulpit. Do you understand that? Paris makes continual references to these factions within the community that are against him. And this is his fear, that he's going to be driven from his job because of what has happened in the forest. And if it gets found out that witchcraft has been happening in his own very house, that is also part of what motivates him, that fear of losing his job. He's very much protecting or trying to protect himself. Abigail says, I think so, sir. Now then, in the midst of such disruption, my own household is discovered to be the very centre of some obscene practice. Abominations are done in the forest. Again, that idea that the forest is where the devil lives. Abigail says it was sport, Uncle, and Paris now becomes angry, and he says, you call this sport? Abigail, if you know something that may help the doctor, for God's sake tell it to him. I saw Tituba waving her arms over the fire when I came on you. Why was she doing that? And I heard screeching and gibberish coming from her mouth. She was swaying like a dumb beast over that fire. She always sings her Barbados songs, and we dance. I cannot blink what I saw, Abigail, for my enemies, he's mentioning them again, will not blink it. I saw a dress lying on the grass. A dress, and I thought I saw someone naked running through the trees. Abigail, in terror, says, no one was naked, you mistake yourself, Uncle. And Paris again is quite angry. He says, I saw it. Now tell me true, Abigail, and I pray you feel the weight of truth upon you. For now my ministry is at stake, my ministry and perhaps your cousin's life. Whatever abomination you have done, give me all of it now, for I dare not be taken unaware when I go before them down there. There is nothing more, Uncle, I swear it. Abigail, I have fought for 3 long years to bend these stiff-necked people to me, and now, just now, when some good respect is rising for me in the parish, you compromise my very character. I have given you a home child.
For more
I have put
information,
clothes
check
upon
out
your
the
back.
6Ps
Now give
podcast,
me the upright
available
answer.
on Spotify,
Your name
Apple
in the town.
Podcasts, and everywhere
It is
in between.
entirely what?
Remember,
is it not?
proper pride preparation prevents
Paris,
poor
he
performance.
outlines the fact that he's found it very difficult to build his reputation in the town. He calls people from Salem stiff-necked. And he says, I'm finally getting some sort of respect, and then you're going to compromise that. Me, the person who has actually housed you. And he goes, do you have a good reputation in the town? And Abigail changes. Now, Abigail becomes the one who's a little bit angry. And she says with an edge of resentment, why, I'm sure of it, sir, there be no blush about my name. Name meaning reputation here. Abigail, is there any other cause than you have told me for you being discharged from Goody Proctor's service? I have heard it said, and I tell you as I heard it, that she comes so rarely to church this year, for she will not sit to so close to something soiled. What signified that remark? And Abigail says she hates me, uncle, she must, for I would not be her slave. It is a bitter woman, a lying, cold, snivelling woman, and I will not work for such a woman. Paris says she may be, and yet it has troubled me that you are now 7 months out of their house, and in all this time no other family has ever called for their service. Abigail says they want slaves, not such as I. Let them send to Barbados for that. I will not black my face for any of them. And with more resentment, she says, do you begrudge my bed, uncle? And Paris is quick to back down. Abigail speaks up to him. In fact, Abigail speaks up to a lot of the authoritative male figures in the text. Again, we talk about role reversal, especially when it comes to genders, and Abigail's able to do that. Abigail, in a quick temper, says, my name is good in the village. I will not have it said my name is soiled, and Goody Proctor is a gossiping liar. We're going to leave it there for now, but just to update you in case you haven't read the text, the Proctors, and they were the family who Abigail used to work for. Of course, young women, particularly young girls, would work in houses until, of course, they got married. So Abigail was working for the Proctors. She was dismissed, and she hasn't been able to find work since. And Paris is very concerned about that because there have been rumours, as we talk about this into the society, there have been rumours about what Abigail got up to and why she was dismissed by Goody Proctor. But Abigail is quick to reject those rumours. So let's have a look at some key quotations. We've already been through these, particularly the first two, but they work really nicely when describing what life was like in the town and a little bit too about their belief system and those social codes and conventions with which the villagers live by in Salem. The idea that children were anything but thankful for being permitted to walk straight, eyes slightly lowered, arms to their sides and mouths shut until bidden to speak. And the irony around that appears later on in Act 3. The other thing is that the fact that their creed forbade anything resembling a theatre or vain enjoyment. And again, this idea that this is what leads to the girls acting like they do, behaving like they do. Yeah, there is no time for them, and Rebecca nurses it really nicely. She says it's just their silly seasons. There's no time for them to be silly. They're restricted within this society. They're not allowed to be kids, and that's a really important factor in what causes the witch trials. And with that, through the next quotation, we see that the witch hunt was a perverse manifestation of the panic which set in among all the classes when the balance began to turn towards greater individual freedom. And this is a nice tie into the Dressmaker, which similarly, Dangatar is in a state of hysteria to an extent about a range of events. It's not just Tilly herself. There's other things that happen that cause hysteria. But the idea that all classes are impacted by that, when there is that shift towards individual freedom. And it's that sense of community that allowed or ensured that Salem survived this harsh lifestyle. When others couldn't, Salem survived. And once individuals started to act selfishly and started acting for themselves, that's when the town breaks down. Just like in the Dressmaker, there's that social destruction within the town. And the last quotation just describes Abigail, who has an endless capacity for dissembling, and the fact that it's those lies which drive the witch trial later on. And again, there's a bit of irony in that too. So what connections can we make between this section of the Crucible and the Dressmaker? And I think the obvious place to start is the two towns, the settings of Dangatar and Salem. So both are quite insular and geographically isolated, and as a result, they hold these really rigid views of themselves and of the world, and there's a real lack of introspection and a lack of progress in the way they think and the way the town is organised. And this links in nicely to the idea of social codes and conventions, which are again quite similar. There are those who are oppressed in both societies, and we know that when these social codes and conventions break down, that's when hysteria increases and rises. And in both towns as well, there are characters who lack individual freedom. And we know particularly in Salem that it was that sense of community and collaboration that enabled them really to survive. And we know that when this sort of contract breaks down and individualism rises, the town breaks down. And we know that long-held hatreds between neighbours could now, as it says in the text, could now be argued in courts and for religious reasons as well. The other thing I think you can look at is definitely the writing style between Ham and Miller. Miller particularly is much more explicit through his authorial interjections and his stage directions and the way that he describes the characters before the audience meets them. You also get through the stage directions specifically the characters' train of thought and also their emotions and their reactions to certain events. Ham is much more implicit. Character development and knowledge is more so based on appearance and clothing. And as we know, we have that third person omniscient perspective. So we get characters' thoughts and feelings through their narration. And while it's predominantly Tilly's, we also have other characters as well. And that's really a nice brief summary of the first section of the Crucible and how we might connect that to the Dressmaker.